All right, so 12 o'clock hour of day 4, the final day of the virtual roadshow. It is time, it's lunchtime, so if you haven't gotten your Grubhub gift card, make sure you do that. So this training last year was probably our most popular training. It's Sonos, networking with Sonos, get you through everything you guys need to know about your network and how to make it function properly, or your client's network, how to make it function properly with your Sonos devices. So we have Matthew back here, who's been with us the past couple days. And then we have Roger and JT, who's going to be able to answer any of your questions that you might have. Go ahead and put those in the Q&A. We're going to be raffling off a pair of the Ace headphones. So put in a good question and we will pick a lucky winner for a pair of headphones. Of course, this is being recorded. We'll have it on our virtual conference center site, so you'll be able to view it after the fact, because I'm pretty sure you'll want to view this again or share it with one of your employees as well. So appreciate you guys being here. Matthew, take it away, buddy.
All right, right on. Again, thank you so much for having me, and appreciate you all being here on our third session, which is, as mentioned, one of our most popular trainings overall. And we're going to dive into like Sonos's recommendation. Basically, if you've ever asked yourself, like, what does Sonos think? What does Sonos say I should do in this circumstance? That's the idea of our presentation here today. We just want to make sure to give you that information. What I'm not going to tell you is that today is about, we're setting lines in the sand and saying, do this or do that. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to say, like, hey, if we're considering Sonos, and if we're only considering Sonos, like, these are the things we would recommend and want you to do. So there are very few like lines in the sand that I'm going to draw, but this should help you kind of, make a more informed decision when networking Sonos products. Your key takeaways today, we're going to, be talking about wired versus wireless, when you might want to consider wiring, when you might want to consider running Sonos on wireless. We're going to talk about wireless channels, disabling Wi-Fi on Sonos. We're going to talk a little bit of spanning tree protocol as well, and how to consider how bonded players are bonded together in a Sonos home theater configuration. If you were to ask me, hey, Newman, what is the number one thing you get asked about from dealers? It is, how do I network home theater? So we're going to talk about that today as well. And as mentioned, Roger and JT are going to be in the chat answering any questions. So please ask those as we go along. Okay, so first, why does networking matter? Well, I don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think it mattered. But the primary reason we talk about networking at Sonos is because that's the backbone of the entire Sonos system. If this isn't configured in a way that will allow Sonos to do what it needs to do, it looks to your customers like Sonos is the problem. And I can tell you, I'm getting ready to celebrate 11 years here at Sonos in a couple of weeks. Probably like 95% of the time that I talk to somebody that's having an issue with Sonos, it's somehow networking related. So, that being said, and the other 5% are a recent app. Just kidding. But it's network related. And so we want to make sure to mitigate as much of those as we possibly can. With Sonos, we want to make sure that customers can listen to, music, podcasts, audiobooks in every room of the home. Now, this is a very simple thing to do from the customer standpoint, but on the back end, it's very, very complex. So we want to make sure that the network is configured properly. So we need to start with the fundamentals, getting started. So when you're getting started with the Sonos system, it's important to know, some general requirements. One, you got to have a Wi-Fi router. It seems like a no-brainer, but we do get asked quite often, like, hey, can I use intranet for this? Can I just set up a network without connecting to the internet? Hey, if you want to use a Sonos system, you got to have the internet, right? You need to have some sort of cable connection, fiber optic connection, something like that. You want to make sure that the Sonos app and all Sonos products are on the same VLAN or subnet. And you want to make sure that support for spanning tree protocol is enabled. This is really only relevant if you're running a managed network, which we know, I should say in most cases, when you're running a managed network. And we'll make sure to talk about that a little bit throughout the course of our time together. Sonos does have a 32 device maximum for a single system. Now, you may be wondering why 32 devices. Well, really, that's sort of a self-implemented limitation. That's just how many products that we can comfortably say can exist on your Wi-Fi network, where we can transmit audio and do all of the back-end things that need to happen for virtually perfect synchronization of audio before we start before we start running into complications with the majority of networks. So 32 device maximum is the maximum on a single system. You remember that more bandwidth will require more complexities and possibly additional configuration with the system. So, wiring and, whether it's wireless or wired, 32 devices is the maximum. Now, here on this slide, we have what's not recommended and what's not supported. The left side is just that. It's not recommended from a Sonos standpoint. I'm not saying you cannot get Sonos to work with the things on the left. It's just that we don't encourage you to do so. One is satellite internet. Yes, even Starlink. That is still satellite internet. We just don't encourage it. Typically, satellite internet has higher latencies, so it's not recommended. Can you use something like Starlink for Sonos? You could. Again, just not recommended. Hotspots or cellular internet. We don't recommend that either. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't do that. In fact, JT and myself and Roger, back in the day, Roger, you might still do this here and there. But taking your Sonos equipment to do some demos, you got to have a cellular data card there to set up the network to demo Sonos, because you need internet. So you can use these things. Again, we just don't encourage it. We also do not encourage using range extenders. In fact, if you talk to certain engineers inside Sonos, they will tell you actually range extenders should be on the not supported side. But we've kept it in the not recommended side because technically it will work, but we highly discourage using range extenders. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you're considering a range extender for Sonos, you should absolutely use a mesh network instead. So consider that. Not supported, routers without internet. The next couple of points really can be summed up with the next 2 points. Anything that's going to cut peer-to-peer communication between players, it's not supported from Sonos. Typically, guest networks will cut off peer-to-peer communication. Enterprise networks will cut off peer-to-peer communication. That is going to be a no-go for Sonos because our products need to be able to communicate with each other to be able to send audio to each other. So that's why we don't work on these products or require additional configuration. And to the point where we say they're not support, those types of networks are not supported. So we do have supported Wi-Fi modes and security standards. I think the thing to sum up here is if it's a major Wi-Fi mode or security standard being used inside of a residential space or even many commercial spaces that aren't run by an enterprise network, we're going to be able to work with that. You'll notice that some of our newer products like Arc Ultra, Era 100, 300, Move 2, and Sub, the newest iteration of Sub 4, which we talked about yesterday, that's available. Arc Ultra and Sub 4 are available October 29th. You can start pre-ordering through 21st Century right now. But that being said, they do support Wi-Fi 6. So, just keep that in mind, something we want to just fundamentally level set with you here. Okay, so now let's get into our conversation of networking. Your general conversation about networking Sonos. We kind of break it down, and you'll hear me talk about things maybe in this sort of way where I mention basic or entry level networks. What I'm really meaning there is just a network with just a single access point. We have our mesh networks and we have a managed network. Now, this is kind of an oversimplification of things, but we felt that it served the purpose of what we're going to be talking about here today. So just wanted to level set with you all, and you may hear me use these terms interchangeably, so you know exactly what I mean when I mean a mesh network or kind of like a basic network. All right, so when you're setting up Sonos, you have one of two different options when configuring Sonos. You can do a wireless setup, which is the easiest way to set up Sonos, or you can wire Sonos. And many times when you wire Sonos, this creates a Sonos net. Now, standard setup or station mode or wireless mode, this is pretty self-explanatory. It's when you set up your Sonos speakers on the wireless system. When you do this, the Sonos speaker is going to connect to the closest access point or the access point that it has the lowest cost path to get to. Standard setup is reliant on the quality of the Wi-Fi signal, so it's important to ensure that any Sonos players that are on this system are within that signal range of the network that it's trying to connect to. Note that when it's in a standard setup or wireless setup, the ports on the back of the Ethernet ports on the back of the players many times are disabled, so you'll want to consider that. So when you are set up in a wireless configuration or in station mode, this is sort of what's happening. All of the players individually, they're all connecting back to that closest access point. So, if you have a basic network or a single AP network, that might be the solution for some customers. However, if you're setting up a mesh network, you can imagine, maybe there's a mesh AP on the bottom there where my access point is. Maybe there's another mesh, AP up in the bedroom. Whatever the cheapest cost path for those players to connect to AP wise, that's the AP that they'll connect to. So when you're running a wireless system, you'll want to remember that that the players are going to connect over 2.4 gigahertz. Now, some of our products connect over 5 gigahertz wirelessly. I'm thinking of our Era 100. I'm thinking of Era 300. I'm thinking of Sonos Arc Ultra, for example. Arc Ultra is our first product to connect to the network via 5 gigahertz. They start off connecting to 2.4, but you can change that in the network settings to put them on 5 gigahertz. So you'll want to consider distances when you're doing that. Running it in Wi-Fi, this is the simplest way to set up Sonos. It's going to get you in and out of the house quick. And frankly, if you're running a mesh system, especially like a tri-band system where there's a dedicated band just for backhaul, frankly, you could probably run more Sonos speakers on wireless than as typically installers we thought of in the past. I talked to a lot of installers that have been installing Sonos for a long time, and sort of, common practice is to wire as much as possible and, kind of consider, hey, I want to try wiring as much as I possibly can. That's fine. And frankly, that, anybody who works in networking will say like, yeah, if you can wire. But I don't think you need to take the assumption of wiring is going to, I need to wire as much Sonos as possible to make sure that the experience is rock solid. In many cases with mesh systems, especially tri-band mesh systems, running Sonos on Wi-Fi is a totally acceptable experience. And you could probably run more on Wi-Fi than what you're comfortable with right now, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Now, of course, this eliminates the need for hardwiring. This could be a benefit in some cases because it makes the installation just that much simpler for you, so you can move on to the next client's home. But you'll want to consider a couple of things. One, it's not ideal for room groups of 6 or more players. So if you know that a customer is going to be consistently grouping 6 or more rooms, you may want to consider wiring some of those players. Now, what I'm not telling you here is that if your customer is grouping 6 or more rooms at a time, you need to wire it for it to work. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if in a consultation with a client, you say, you're asking them questions and they're like, yeah, I entertain a lot and I'm going to have these 6+ rooms grouped together very often, you may want to consider wiring more than you normally would. It's also not preferred when you have multiple players very close to each other, say in a rack, for example. A lot of amps or a lot of ports are in a rack. They're really close together. They're all creating a mesh network, so-called Sonos net. Well, when you have a lot of Wi-Fi radios on really, really in close proximity to each other, that, as you know, can cause interference. So you may not want to run wireless players in a rack configuration. You may want to shut Wi-Fi off on most of those players. And it also, depends on the materials of the building. If you're working in an older home, legacy home with a lot of brick, a lot of plaster, concrete walls, that sort of thing, maybe in a commercial space, you'll probably want to avoid running a wireless system. Now, the other way to set up Sonos is with a wire, running Sonos to the network via an Ethernet cable. Now, when you do this, any Sonos product that you plug in as the first product wired to the system, if you do not shut off the Wi-Fi, it is going to create SonosNet. SonosNet is our proprietary mesh network where each Sonos product that runs SonosNet or that supports SonosNet receives and repeats a Wi-Fi signal just for Sonos products. This can be great if you are wanting to provide a stronger, more robust network connection to a Sonos speaker that might be a little further than what the network can handle. Now, players on SonosNet, they all communicate over the 2.4 gigahertz band, which has a theoretical maximum of about 50 feet between players. Of course, you'll want to consider wall materials and other things causing interference that can reduce that 50-foot maximum. But you'll want to consider that when installing Sonos. If you do run a wire to a Sonos product, if you are leaving Wi-Fi turned on that product, you will want to consider leaving that product 3 feet or more away from the access point. So if that access point is, broadcasting a Wi-Fi signal, and you have another product in close proximity that's broadcasting SonosNet, that could cause some interference. This is not this is not a line in the sand. Installers do that all the time, but maybe if you're running a bunch of Sonos amps in a rack and ports in a rack, and you set the access point on top of the system, on top of the rack, and then maybe you leave the Wi-Fi turned on in the amp that's a little further down the rack, at least feet away from it. That's all I'm saying here. Just a best practice, not an absolute necessity. So wired benefits, look, anybody, like I said, who works in networking is going to say, if you can hardwire a Sonos, any networking product, you might as well wire that networking product. Players, you can have a mix of wired players and wireless players, and this is helpful in most Wi-Fi environments. However, this is not a one size fix all. We'll fix every problem that you could have here. Just like any other networking potential issue, there may be, what works in one home doesn't work in the next home. So, you'll want to consider like, hey, this isn't a cure-all, right? This is going to require me running Ethernet cable to these players, and that is going to incur, additional cost for my customer who may be working within a particular budget. You also want to consider, this is a big one, my bottom point here, Arc Ultra, Era 100, Era 300, Roam, and Move do not support SonosNet. Again, these products do not support SonosNet. So if you hardwire an Arc Ultra, thinking, this will extend to another player that's, over here in this corner of the room, it's not going to do that. Once the one of those products, specifically Arc Ultra or one of the Era speakers, has an Ethernet plugged into it and it sees data, it actually cuts the Wi-Fi card completely. It turns the Wi-Fi card off on that player. So you'll want to consider that too. Now, for interference, if you are getting any sort of interference, if you're running SonosNet, a best practice is to change the channel for SonosNet and to change the channel on the router. So you'll log into the router settings, and then you will put the router on channel 1, 6, or 11, and that is going to put it on one of the non-overlapping channels on the 2.4 gigahertz band. The next thing you'll want to do is you'll want to go into the Sonos app. You'll want to go into settings. You'll want to go into manage in the network. From there, you can select SonosNet channel. And then you can change the SonosNet channel to one of the other non-overlapping channels. So if you set the router, the network to channel 1, then you'll want to set SonosNet to channel 6 or channel 11. Really here, you're just keeping those off of non-overlapping channels, which will help avoid interference overall. Another best practice here is, unless you need it for something else, turn off auto channel select. If you do not turn off auto channel select, the network, hours later will decide, hey, I need to switch channels to control traffic better, and it will just undo this setting for you. So you'll want to turn off auto channel select before you go through and manually set the channel. But that's our recommendation to avoid interference. Remember, this is only relevant if you are running SonosNet for the Sonos system. Now, disabling Wi-Fi is another way that you can help avoid interference on the network. You may want to consider disabling the Wi-Fi if you have a bunch of players in a rack. I mentioned earlier, maybe you have 10 amps and 10 ports in a rack. Well, you don't want all of those. You want to wire them all, but you don't want all of those broadcasting SonosNet. So you'll turn off Wi-Fi on all of those products. If you want, you can leave Wi-Fi turned on the first product that you set up, and that will emit SonosNet. both Sonos AMP and Sonos port support SonosNet. So that can create SonosNet and broadcast SonosNet if you want to install other SonosNet compatible products wirelessly. Keep in mind, any product wirelessly you configure after that that does support SonosNet. Maybe it's Arc, maybe it's Subgen 3 in this transition period before Arc Ultra comes out. Maybe it's Sonos One SL, for example, or a Sonos 5. Those products all support SonosNet. So Beam is another one. Ray is another one. If you set up one of those products wirelessly, it will connect to SonosNet if you leave SonosNet turned on one of those products in the rack. Now, if you wanted to stabilize network connectivity and just lower the overall cost path of the network, disabling Wi-Fi makes sense on as many products, but it doesn't always make sense to turn off Wi-Fi. Like I mentioned, if you want to add a wireless player that supports SonosNet and you want it to connect to SonosNet, you'll need to leave Wi-Fi turned on one of those products. Another big one here, if you zoned out because of my sultry voice for the last few minutes, zone back in, tune in here for me. If you are installing home theater products, and we're going to talk about this more later. I get a lot of questions on this. If you are installing a Sonos home theater system and you want players to connect wirelessly, you have to leave the Wi-Fi turned on the home theater primary, which is the home theater product plugged into the television. So keep that in mind. If you hardwire an Arc and you're like, well, I'm going to turn Wi-Fi on because it doesn't need to connect to the network, but you want to add a sub wirelessly to that Arc, not going to happen. The Wi-Fi card is cut off. So you'll want to leave the Wi-Fi turned on in that scenario. This is why that's important. This is why I'm even mentioning that. Let's say you install a Sonos, or previously you have installed a Sonos Arc for a customer, and that subwoofer is wireless, and you want it to connect wireless. Cool, no problem. Leave the Wi-Fi turned on the sub wirelessly. Well, any product you try to set up after that is going to want to connect to SonosNet to that Sonos Arc. So if you don't want SonosNet, then you would have to shut off the Wi-Fi on that Sonos Arc, hardwire the Arc, and hardwire the sub back to the network for those two products to connect. So keep that in mind. Again, when I mentioned this already, but I'll mention it again. The Era speakers and Arc Ultra and Era 100 Pro, they automatically turn off Wi-Fi when hardwired to the network and they see data. Now, if you want to go, the other way, if you ever need to go from a wired to a wireless connection, you can do that too. And you do that by going to settings, then manage the network, and then update network. And you can type in the credentials for the network, and the system should just switch you over from a hardwired connection to a wireless connection. So keep that in mind if you ever want to do that. All right, now let's talk about Sonos in a rack. We get this question a lot as well. From Sonos' standpoint, this is our recommendation. Like, if you call our support team, this is what they should tell you. We recommend individually, if you're going to hardwiring every player with its own Ethernet cable individually back to the switch or back to the gateway router, whatever that looks like, for the best overall performance and fastest synchronization of audio. So again, our recommendation, if you can, individually run an Ethernet cable to every Sonos product. That is best case scenario from an installation standpoint. But we get it. It's not always feasible, doesn't always make sense, and that's okay. You can daisy chain Sonos components. In fact, many of you are probably already daisy chaining components. And when I mentioned that on the last slide, you're like, what the heck, Newman? What are you talking about? Totally get it. So here's the thing. You can daisy chain Sonos products, but classic STP, which is what Sonos utilizes, has a recommended bridge span limitation of 4 bridges, with that first product being the first unit in that bridge or in that daisy chain. So 3 other products after that. Overall, keep daisy chaining as low as possible. Here's why. 1, if you do too many products, that can cause a network loop, cause some confusion, cause Sonos players to drop out. 2, equally as important, if one of those players drops out in that daisy chain, you've now lost the other players that are relying on that player for a signal. So if your client is having a dinner party, they're having people over, and the first amp in the daisy chain cuts out, they now have 4 zones of Sonos that don't work. Where if it is just an individual player running back to that network, That's the only player. That's the only Sonos product that doesn't work. So you kind of you isolate things. And you minimize your chance for bigger problems. So overall, keep daisy chaining as low as you possibly can. Don't go over 4 if you can avoid it. I've talked to certain people that'll say don't go over 7. We just say like, hey, overall, keep it 4 or less if you can. But again, Sonos uses spanning tree protocol. In our spanning tree protocol, it isn't different from any other mesh system using spanning tree protocol. And by the way, this is only when you're using Sonos Net. So keep that in mind. If you're not using Sonos Net, we're running off of what the mesh network is doing, or what the wireless network is doing. So when you're using Sonos Net and you're connecting players via Sonos Net, we're running spanning tree protocol. And again, the overall point here is to prevent sluggish performance or total network dropouts. So spanning tree protocol is pretty important with Sonos Net. We're running these BPDUs, and these BPDUs are transmitted every 2 seconds. And the idea here is that we want to eliminate the cost path. We want to eliminate as much cost path as possible. So obviously, wireless connection between players has a much higher cost path, 15 times higher cost path on average than a wired connection. So when spanning tree protocol is implemented, it takes kind of these irrelevant, redundant cost paths, and it gets rid of those cost paths, right? We don't want to have those redundancies. By the way, this can cause a network loop, and it can cause not just your Sonos system to crash if not implemented properly. This can cause an entire network to crash if, again, not implemented properly. Now, products that do not support STP are the same products that don't support SonosNet. Because remember, this is only relevant when you are using SonosNet. So STP is not utilized when you are in a wireless configuration, or if you're, if you're trying to troubleshoot Arc Ultra or Era 100, for example. We also do not support RSTP. Sure, inevitably somebody will ask. I'll just say it like this. You'll notice that all of our newer products do not support spanning tree protocol, and they do not support SonosNet. I can't comment on our future product roadmap, but I will just say, infer from that what you will. Many of our new products do not support spanning tree protocol or SonosNet, so why implement a new technology that none of our newer products support? Now, why am I having a conversation with you all of this? Because really, the fact of the matter is, you don't control SonosNet. Sonos is designed in a way where our products just handle their business. They just do what they need to do. Well, the reason I'm discussing this is because many of you are installing managed networks. Well, we would love for you to not have to install managed networks, because Sonos works best when it's plugged into an unmanaged network for most people, because an unmanaged network is just going to let Sonos need to do what it needs to do. However, it makes sense for our installer partners to install managed networks in many cases. So, the reason I'm talking about all of this is because a managed switch, by default, there are settings that are enabled that are, or set in a way that could possibly stop spanning tree protocol from Sonos doing what it needs to do. And as an installer, all Sonos really needs you to do is tell the managed switch, hey, just let Sonos handle its business. Don't worry about Sonos. So you're going to want to make sure spanning tree is enabled. That operation stage is enabled. You want to make sure that BPDU is handling is set to flooding. You want to make sure that the path cost is set to short. So these settings here are our recommended settings to ensuring that your managed switch is going to let Sonos just do what it needs to do. By the way, you can find these settings just by Google searching Sonos managed switch settings. Same with firewall ports. Sometimes firewall ports can be configured that will stop peer-to-peer communication, stop Sonos from doing what it needs to do. So, these are our recommended port settings on a network. Again, you can search this by just searching Sonos networking firewall ports. So it's a common question our support team gets asked, so we wanted to make sure to address it here. All right, just a couple of other things to note that we wanted to mention to you. One, AP client wireless isolation. We don't recommend enabling this. This can cause problem with peer-to-peer communication. Also, wideband Wi-Fi or 40 40 hertz Wi-Fi band. This can improve overall throughput for the network, but it can cause more adjacent channel interference. So we would just encourage staying away from wideband Wi-Fi and staying on the 20 megahertz band when you're configuring a network for Sonos. All right, our next topic is home theater bonding. Again, this is a question that we get a ton of. So we're going to talk through some home theater bonding. Now, the first thing that you need to know is when you're setting up a Sonos home theater, we have a home theater primary. The home theater primary, and if you were with us yesterday, I promised you some education on this. So hopefully this piqued your interest. So a home theater primary, consider this the fronts of the home theater system. This can be Arc Ultra, this could be Beam, Sonos Ray, or Sonos Amp, whatever Sonos product is plugged into the TV. Then you have bonded players or secondary players. These secondary players are the players that are bonded to the home theater primary. This could be a sub, this could be surround sounds, both of those things or one of those things. Now, here's the reason this is important is because you need to know how they communicate with each other. The home theater primary is called the home theater primary because that's what's controlling everything on that home theater system. It's controlling the crossover, the audio crossover, and it's acting as a WAP for that home theater system. And that is what's providing a Sonos home theater, the bonded players, that's what's providing them a network connection. So it's key that the home theater primary is able to communicate with those secondary players. So these secondary players need to be within a distance that these players can communicate with each other. Now that distance is determined by the 5 gigahertz bond that those players do. There are 3 network technologies at play here that you really need to know about. The first one is the wireless connection to the access point in that location. In a home theater setup, the home theater primary is going to use this for its network connection. The secondaries will use it for the initial setup, but will use a different network to connect to the home theater system. And that secondary connection is that 5 gigahertz connection that the Sonos Arc Ultra or the Beam, the home theater primary, is broadcasting. So a home theater primary is broadcasting a secondary 5 gigahertz network that the bonded players are going to connect to. One second. Okay. That the players are going to connect to. The reason that's important is because remember, 5 gigahertz only has a theoretical maximum of about 30 feet or 9 meters. So, and again, walls and things like that, interference can, any RF frequencies that can cause interference and drop that 30-foot theoretical maximum. So if you're trying to add a subwoofer that's really far away, or if you've ever tried installing a Sonos amp really far away from the home theater primary, let's say the primary is in the living room and the amp is in a rack in the basement somewhere, if it's more than 30 feet, that's going to be an issue if you're trying to connect those players wirelessly. So really, again, you need to consider a couple of things here. The home theater primary's connection to the home's network and the secondary players connection to the home theater primary. Now you have a couple of different options here when you're installing Sonos home theater products. You can run everything wirelessly, which is what I showed on this slide. You can just have it all running on Wi-Fi. Again, if you're running a tri-band mesh network, or even if it just has a good connection and you're running more of a basic network, it's probably going to be fine running Sonos home theater systems on Wi-Fi. I would say you're probably more than what you're currently comfortably doing. You can run Sonos on Wi-Fi. But your other option here is to wire the Sonos Arc to the network. You're going to leave the Wi-Fi turned on the Sonos network, just give it a rock solid connection. And then the other players will connect over that 5 gigahertz frequency, the network that the home theater primary is putting out. So instead of connecting the Arc to the wireless, you're now hardwiring the Arc, and you're leaving the Wi-Fi turned on the Arc so that I can communicate wirelessly with secondary players. Another option that you have is to hardwire the home theater primary and hardwire the secondary product that you want to hardwire. again, in an amp, in a scenario where you have an amp, I mentioned a scenario earlier where the arc is way off, maybe in the living room somewhere, and the amp is living in a rack in a media room. Well, if you're going to hardwire the amp, you're also going to want to hardwire the home theater primary. And we're going to talk about why here in a second. So this is another option. You can hardwire the amp. You could hardwire the sub. If you're just trying to get some of the players off of the Wi-Fi, no problem. You can do that. But you're going to leave Wi-Fi turned on the home theater primary so it can bond with another product wirelessly, like the Sonos sub. The other option is to hardwire everything. So that it just has a solid connection back to the network. In this case, if you wanted, you could shut Wi-Fi off on all of the products. The reason I have an X here is because when you hardwire an amp as rears, it cuts off the network. It cuts off the Wi-Fi card. So the other option is to hardwire everything and turn the Wi-Fi off on every product on this home theater bond. So to break it down real simple, your three options here: leave it all wireless, only hardwire the home theater primary, or hardwire the primary and a secondary, but leave the Wi-Fi turned on, or hardwire everything and turn the Wi-Fi off. Really, the only thing we highly encourage you to stay away from is only hardwiring a secondary player and not hardwiring the home theater primary. In a scenario like this, it's very easy in my scenario that I mentioned for installers, to say, and many do this, to say like, hey, there's an amp in the rack, the amp's in the rack. I'm just going to hardwire the amp to get it off the network, and I'm going to leave the Sonos Arc wireless in the other room. The problem with that is, remember, the Sonos Arc is what's controlling the crossover, and it's what's controlling the network for that system. So if the secondary player is able to connect to if it's able to get a signal faster than the primary is able to send that information to it, that can cause desynchronization of audio and just drop out from your Sonos system altogether. So we just highly, highly, highly discourage you from doing that. Another thing that I want to mention is secondary players are always going to bond over 5 gigahertz. There's no way to avoid it. That's just inherent. That's just what Sonos products do to when they're bonding. The reason is because of there's less obviously interference, which means we can synchronize that audio more reliably. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to set up a sub on the other side of a room that's further than 30 feet from the Sonos Arc Ultra, from the home theater primary, probably not going to connect very well. You may want to consider hardwiring. Another thing, I've mentioned this, but wanted to make sure we just really called this out. Arc Ultra is the first Sonos home theater primary that does not emit SonosNet. Arc Ultra does not emit SonosNet. So if you hardwire it, it cuts its Wi-Fi off automatically to the network, but it leaves its Wi-Fi turned on for the bonding of a home theater system. But if you manually turn Wi-Fi off on the Sonos Arc, it will cut that bond for home theater connectivity as well. So you'll want to consider that. You also should take some time to mention which products will work with home theater. Really, the only call out that I want to make here is that Era 300 only can connect to Arc Ultra, Arc, or Beam Gen 2 because of Dolby Atmos. For the most part, any of our modern products bond with any of our modern home theater primaries, bond with any of our modern secondary players. Also wanted to give a quick shout out that you can run Era 100 Pro for home theater configurations. This is nice when installing AC main is just not an option, and you're trying to put surround somewhere where just there's no outlet. Great solution, but keep in mind, if you run data to the Era 100 Pro, it's going to cut off its Wi-Fi card. So if you're running data to Era 100 Pro and to the home theater primary, if you're using Era 100 Pro, you're going to need to hardwire the home theater primary as well. There is one way around this, though. I mentioned before, and we do offer additional education on this if you want to join us for that. If you run Era 100 into a injector, without running that injector back into the network for data, it'll keep the Wi-Fi card turned on the ER100 Pros. Okay. Next, let's talk some networking scenarios. We're just going to give you some high level scenarios here, just in kind of like our high level recommendations. So we're going to talk about things again in the aspect of like a single router or access point, mesh networks, or managed networks. Move a little quicker through this for the sake of time here. So if you're running, just a single router or access point, remember that all 32 Sonos products can connect wirelessly, but they will all require a reliable connection back to the access point. So those further off Sonos products may not have a reliable connection. So you'll want to consider that. The router in this case handles all network traffic between players because you, of course, are not using SonosNet. Now consider, if you're grouping, you'll want to consider wiring. Again, if your client is consistently grouping 6 or more rooms of Sonos at a time. If there's a high network demand, maybe there are a lot of people living in the home. There's a lot of 4K, video streaming, a lot of video game playing. So overall high network demand, you may want to consider wiring some Sonos. And if there are dead zones or weak spots in the network, you may want to consider wiring some Sonos. Now, once you hardwire a piece of Sonos that supports SonosNet, there is a player that is going to be the root bridge. Typically, this is the player that's set up first in a SonosNet configuration, but that root bridge is like the quarterback of a SonosNet network. SonosNet, the players will now bond over SonosNet, and the root bridge will be kind of like, again, the quarterback of that SonosNet, deciding where all of the traffic goes. You can optimize performance by adjusting the router and SonosNet channels, as we mentioned, and keeping them on non-overlapping channels on the 2.4 gigahertz band. If possible, centralize the root bridge. This will optimize connectivity. So the first player that you set up, if you know it's going to run SonosNet and you want it to, try to make that a centrally located player within the entire system. Again, not necessary, just for perfect optimization in a perfect world. This device should be connected to the router with a roughly 3-foot distance in between the router or switch, or I should say access point, and that player itself. So you'll want to consider too that not all of our players connect to SonosNet. So in my image here, Era 300 does not connect to SonosNet if SonosNet's being broadcasted. So it still needs a reliable connection back to the network. Optimal hardwiring, again, hardwire products in dead zones or weak spots. Utilize an unmanaged switch if you can for each player, and use a dedicated network cable for each individual Sonos speaker. You can disable Wi-Fi on hardwired players to reduce signal interference, but be considerate of if another player is using SonosNet or not. So if you have a Sonos 5 somewhere where it's on the edge of the network, and hey, another player is probably getting a SonosNet connection from this player. If you cut Wi-Fi off on that Sonos 5, that other player in that dead zone or weak spot may be relying on that Sonos 5 for a SonosNet connection. So you'll want to consider that too. So next we'll discuss some mesh networking guidance. Now, again, Sonos products, all 32 of them can be on Wi-Fi if that's what, if technically from a Sonos standpoint, they can all work on Wi-Fi, and they will all need a solid connection back to the AP. This is more desirable because there are more APs throughout the house or place of business that these Sonos products can connect to. In this case, again, the router will handle the network traffic. You'll want to be sure, if within your customer's budget, it should be, to sell them a tri-band mesh network that provides that dedicated band for backhaul. This will offer improved wireless performance via front haul, which is what those Sonos speakers and other devices on the network will be using. Consider a dynamic backhaul system that uses these 3 bands. And now the front haul is going to handle all of the traffic in this consideration. The network is handling all of the network in this situation. So if you're using a mesh network, frankly, you could probably, again, run more Sonos than you're comfortable with usually on a wireless configuration. but maybe you want to wire a player or two on the system and you want to create Sonos Net. Maybe there are dead zones or weak spots. Maybe you're just trying to get some players off the network. That's fine. Remember to try to keep that 3-foot distance between the AP and the gateway and the Sonos players. All wired players should be wired to the same switch to the same switch, which is then wired to the primary mesh node. What we don't want you to do is hardwire to a leaf node. You may be able to do one or a couple of Sonos players. I would discourage you doing that altogether if you can. What happens is if you hardwire a Sonos player and multiple Sonos players into those secondary APs on the system, that can cause a network loop. So if you can wire in, and I shouldn't say if you can, we highly encourage you to only wire into the gateway node on a mesh network. You'll also want to make sure that the mesh system, they all share the same subnet, and you'll want to disable router channel select. Multiple mesh networks might cause interference, so you want to keep that in mind. SonosNet might not be the answer if you're already using a mesh network, because now you're broadcasting SonosNet and you're broadcasting a mesh system. So keep that in mind if you're leaving Wi-Fi turned on a hardwired Sonos player. All right, and then managed networks. Look, managed networks, really same rules apply if you're running a managed network and you have some wireless players. So we won't spend a lot of too much time there, but the main thing is just follow the guidance I mentioned earlier. If you're running a managed system, just make sure that managed system is allowing Sonos to run spanning tree protocol if you're hardwiring any Sonos products that support SonosNet. Also, some unique applications. They're not really unique. They just didn't kind of fit into a specific box when we were developing this content. But dense Wi-Fi environments. The name of the game here is wiring as many Sonos products as you can. This will alleviate interference. Turn off Wi-Fi as much as you can. This will alleviate interference. Use a single AP or mesh system. Either way, it's the same. You could also separate 5 gigahertz and 2.4 Wi-Fi networks with distinct SSIDs. This keeps players associated to 5 gigahertz on 5 gigahertz, as opposed to bouncing back and forth between the 2.4 or 5 gigahertz band. You also want to prioritize hardwiring Sonos components, as I mentioned, and disabling Wi-Fi. And then if you can connect any 5 gigahertz compatible Sonos products, if you can connect it to 5 gigahertz, connect it to 5 gigahertz to avoid interference. Again, if you're working in a dense Wi-Fi environment, interference is the name of the game here. It's very similar with commercial applications as well. Avoid interference. Hardwire as many devices as you can back to a single switch, and that switch back to the router if possible. Enable Wi-Fi on Sonos if future Wi-Fi players are planned. But if you can turn Wi-Fi off on a Sonos player in a dense Wi-Fi environment, you're going to want to turn Wi-Fi off. And then follow our support for managed networking if you need to run a managed switch in this space. Finally, we do offer lifetime support on our products. That's not to be confused with a lifetime warranty. It just means that if your client bought a Sonos amp 5 years ago and they call with, a problem, or you call with a problem, we're going to help walk you through that problem and get that problem fixed. You can reach our support at sonos.com/contact and reach out to our support team, and they'd be happy to help you. Okay, so that's kind of what we have for you here today. Hopefully we got all of your questions answered. I want to be very respectful of time and the next session, but today we discussed wireless versus wired configuration, some managed switch guidance, avoiding interference, home theater bonding. That's the big one. Hopefully if you took anything away from our conversation today, you took away how to properly bond a home theater system. If you have any questions in the future, please reach out at sonos.com or sonos-education@sonos.com. That sends an email to us trainers where we can answer your questions. Other than that, that's all I got. That's everything. I will pass it back over to Mark to transition us.
Great job, Matt. Matthew, as always. Really appreciate all this. I know those questions are still coming in, and thanks to JT and Roger for answering them. If you want to review this after the fact too, if you get the Q&A down there, you've got the sonos-education.com Sonos-education at sonos.com. So you could reference this video again on our virtual conference center. Mauricio, thank you for your question. You're going to be the winner of the Sonos Ace. I'll send you information for that. And again, can't thank you enough, Matthew, for the past 3 days of great information from commercial, the new Era 100 Pro to home theater, and for networking as well. So thank you so much, guys.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
All right, we'll see everybody.